time again for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
And we're the Insiders. So, Scott, we had the State of the State speech, and Governor Evers made some proposals. Give me your take on the state of the state and where we're headed.
Well, I've been paying attention to the State of the State speeches for a long time. I used to have the opportunity to help Governor Thompson write some of his. And I think they've sort of changed over the last 25, 30 years. The speeches used to be much more a dominant news item, always on the front page, banks of cameras, multiple news stories on television. And I just think over the last, I'll say 3 governors, they've become more boring and more routine. The media's relationship with the politicians has changed so that it's not as big of a deal as an announcement. They've gone from, at least this year, I think, it went from the sort of report card we would get on the status of the state that, the economy is strong, jobs are up, we're building this, we're #1 in the country in that, and the Packers are doing great. Usually a governor will stick that in there somewhere. Instead, this speech was much more of an election-oriented speech. I mean, the governor talked about topics you don't normally hear in a State of the State speech, things like the legislative maps, abortion, voting access. Those are kind of unusual topics for a State of the State speech. Most of the time, the governor's not saying, and we're going to build X, and we're going to give this grant out over here. So I think that has changed over time. And I think that, this governor, like the last couple, isn't getting the pop that you used to get. In fact, that's why I think the traveling around the state after the speech has become so important, because the governor has to give like a local angle in order to get that sort of coverage from the media. And that's why Governor Evers traveled all over the state this week after his speech to try to get some local coverage that he didn't necessarily get when he gave his address in Madison.
Well, I think there's some truth in what Scott says. I think that it's also, remember, it is an election year. It is not a budget year. Because we do biennial budgets in Wisconsin, I think the state of the state is always much more significant in the budget year. So that means at the start of a governor's term and in the middle of the governor's term. The other state of the states, it's really kind of running into an election year. And I think that Scott is right. I think that was some of what was in the thing. There were substantive proposals like childcare. And I think, and by the way, the other thing that we have to remember about this is with an overwhelmingly gerrymandered map. So you have overwhelming majorities for the Republicans. They don't ever want to give Governor Evers a win. And even Republican governors have told me that. So the reality is that this is not something anymore where the press says, well, this is going to generate something that's going to happen. But I think the reason Governor Evers emphasized childcare is that this is something that should be a bipartisan effort because Republicans really do want business success. I believe that is at the core of their values. And so do Democrats. And the only way you're going to get more success and more people in the job market in Wisconsin is if you do something to draw more women into the market. And that's what the whole childcare thing is about. We know that young women who have children, young, under age 40 or even under age 50, if they have them in the household, as long as they can get childcare, they want to go out and work if they can. They need the money. And so if we can solve or help them subsidize the childcare, we'll get benefit. And by the way, this is another example of where government is subsidizing. But they always say, oh, it's for the poor people. No, this is government actually subsidizing the businesses of our state and trying to help them have a better workforce and more people available. I think it's a great idea. It should be bipartisan. I think that's why the governor emphasized it. On some of the other issues, yes, I think Scott is right. I think abortion is really talking about, we're not going to get anything through the Republican legislature. They can't even agree amongst themselves about a 14-week abortion ban. I think what's going to happen is that this is going to be the powerful issue again in this election. And I think that Republicans want to get away from that as quickly as they can. And the governor, of course, made sure that he brought it up in the State of the State speech. And I think that that's what should be done. Now, there is one other element. I have to admit, Scott was in these days. Scott was part of this. Governor Thompson was great. He was a great showman. He would always have not one, not two. There would be 3 or 4 different people. It was always a source of speculation before we got to the state to say, who's he going to bring in today? And of course, the most popular is always Gilbert Brown from the Green Bay Packers, or whatever team just happened to win, a nationwide trophy. So I think that it has changed. I think the marketplace for media has changed. I think it is more local, as Scott pointed out. I do think that there is a change when you have a partisan legislature that is just not going to touch anything the governor's going to do. And the final thing I would say is it's an election year. It's not a budget year.
Well, when we worked on those speeches with Governor Thompson, I would tell the staff, we can't go over 20 minutes on the read, because then when we would give it to Tommy, it would get expanded with, and then we bring in the Badgers and the marching band comes in, and then there's this special guest, and then there's that. And you know how there has to be all sorts of applause, and everyone has to stand up multiple times for all that and give them a standing ovation. I was like, oh my gosh, the speech itself can't be more than 20 minutes, because then he would extend it to an hour and 10. It would just go on and on and on. So yeah, the days of the spectacle are gone. The one substantive policy item I think that the governor talked about in this speech, the child care workforce issue, I just think there's a fundamental difference between the parties about their vision. The governor's essentially trying to create a state entitlement on top of the federal entitlement program. And the Republicans are saying we're willing to provide some sort of tax credit so that individuals can go out and make these decisions rather than the government subsidizing businesses directly. So I think that's the distinction between the two of them. You would think they could figure out a way to get to an agreement on that, but apparently not.
We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.